followers, and welcome back to the question where you have the questions and I have the answers. And I did not intend on making a YouTube video today because I like to wait at least a little bit so people can watch my last YouTube video and whatever. I don't know, that's just a me thing. But I was uploading my Hamilton video and I noticed that somebody had commented on my Juneteenth video that they wanted a part 2, and I was thinking to myself, what could I possibly say about this subject that I didn't say before? So I went back and I rewatched it and I said that I would talk about slavery in a later video. So this is said later video. This is going to be the history of slavery, both as a broad subject but mainly in the US and how it has shaped the world that we live in today. So we're just going to jump right into it. If you are new, my content is wildly chaotic, but you should subscribe, you should like, and you should totally share. Okay, slavery is said to have started 11,000 years ago due to the advent of agriculture. Basically, we've already been doing this, that major industry exists on the back of slave labor. Either legal slavery or illegal slavery, but I'll get to that in a minute. And has existed in many cultures such as ancient Egypt, ancient China, Assyria, Babylonia, ancient Iran, ancient Greece, ancient India, the Roman Empire, Nubia, and pre-colonial America. So it's not just a white person's taking, not just a white people taking a colored people and making them slaves. People enslaved other people for many reasons which I'll get to now. These are reasons such as debt slavery, basically like if I owed you money, instead of paying you back, I could just work off the debt that I owe you. Punishment for a crime, which we still have now, and I said so in my Instagram about how the Emancipation Proclamation's loophole is that you can have slavery as punishment for a crime. Anyway, prisoners of war. So basically, if we captured you in a war, you could be used as a slave. Child abandonment, and just straight up slavery. We take you as slave, and your family basically is slaves for their entire life. Now, those are the reasons for slavery, and now we're going to get to North American slavery. The first slaves were brought to America in 1619. There were 20 slaves from Angola brought to America from a Dutch ship, and actually they were stolen from a Portuguese slave ship, then brought to America. And slaves and indentured servants became common practice in 1940. An indentured servant is somebody who signs a contract to be a slave up until a certain point. Say, once again, it's kind of like that debt slavery where it's like you are not getting paid for your work, but you don't have to work your entire life. You're working up until your debt is paid off. That's kind of what an indentured servant is. So, in 1640, both forms of unpaid labor were commonplace, but they weren't legal quite yet. Also, a fun fact is, they had the whole Atlantic slave trade, that's kind of garnered by England and also goes to all the different colonies from Europe, which is not only North America, but also the Caribbean and South America. Only 5% of all slaves garnered by that slave trade came to North America. And we had a lot of slaves. We had thousands, hundreds of thousands of slaves, and that was only 5%. The majority went to Brazil or the Caribbean. That's horrifying to think about. In 1680, larger numbers of slaves began coming to America because by then, in 1660, England set up the I can't remember what it was England basically started profiting off of slavery and was having it basically had a whole slave industry set up in Africa where prisoners of war of a certain tribe could be bought and sold to different countries and different colonies. So basically by 1680, England had a whole system of slavery, which, when it started, basically in America, maybe 20 or so slaves were being brought in. Now it was by the hundreds of thousands being brought in, whole ships and whatever. Now to get to some statistics, just facts being read off. In 1640, Virginia sentences John Punch to a lifetime of slavery. Wow, what was that? Okay. Basically what happened was John Punch was an indentured servant, meaning that he had signed a contract saying he was going to be, this person's, unpaid labor for a certain amount of time. He tried to escape, and then Virginia said that, oh, well, now that you had your chance of freedom, you shirked it, so now you're going to be a slave forever. In 1641, Massachusetts legalized slavery. In 1650, Connecticut legalized slavery. In 1654, Virginia allows black men to own slaves. This is really important because, once again, indentured servitude was as common as slavery, and slaves weren't as big of a thing as they were until like after the Revolution. So basically, black men and women were getting their freedom because they were only indentured servants, and this law in 1654 in Virginia allowed those people who were servants who were now freemen, saying that they could own servants but only black servants. In 1662, Virginia declares the child the same as the mother, which is really important because, people basically, women getting custody of their children through like any legal battle is a fairly new thread. Back then it was all men are superior and so forth. So basically, because women are too emotional and whatever, too weak, so all children would basically go to the man. What makes this law so important is that it now basically said that if the woman is a slave, if the mom of the child is a slave, then the child is a slave, which means that now these masters, these slave owners, can rape their slaves and whatever, and the children would still be declared a slave. They wouldn't have to take care, they'd still be treated as a slave. This is really important. Okay, then 1663, Maryland legalizes slavery. 1664, slavery legalized in New York and New Jersey. And in 1670, shit hits the fan because everything's kind of like, you have your indentured servants and black people can still have rights once they've finished off, that law. And yeah, Virginia's kind of getting iffy, but it's still like there. And then Carolinas bring a shit ton of slaves because people who colonized Carolina were like plantation owners from the Bahamas. Once again, there are a lot more slaves in the Caribbean and South America than there are in America. So they go and they colonize both North and South Carolina, and they bring a shit ton of slaves and a lot of racism with them. Flash forward to the Bacon Rebellion. Basically, people are getting upset that these black people have the ability to have slaves, and therefore their plantations are able to compete with white plantations, and they showed their dislike of that by burning Jamestown to the ground. And then, this is where it gets nasty, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. Basically, South Carolina says that, if you are black, you are automatically declared a slave. We can do whatever we have to keep you in line, including beating, burning, tarring, whatever. And everyone else in the nation is kind of just like, what the shit, South Carolina? But then they said, that might be a good idea, and followed suit. And until then, between that period of time to the Revolution, many rebellions took place, and seeing that we don't learn about them, they obviously either were not successful or they were successful and we just don't hear about it because we only teach white history. In 1772, England outlaws the slave trade in England. Basically, so now England, even though they basically ran the slave trade, is no longer going to partake in the Atlantic slave trade. And Massachusetts, which is still like a big supporter of England at this time, started following suit and was allowing slaves to basically sue their owners for freedom. And it worked. Massachusetts granted freedom to 17 slaves, which actually isn't a lot, but it was a big deal back then. Vermont banned slavery in 1777 and kept it banned upon entering the Union in 1791. In 1804, slavery was banned in northern states. Like, not really. It was banned, but it's like, well, you can't be slaves, but it's like, we're not going to make you free people. We're going to make you technically indentured servants. So it's like, you're not slaves, but you still have to work for these people for a contracted period of time, which could once again be longer than your lifespan. Like, you could do a whole like Otto von Bismarck and be like, you're going to work until you are 60 years old, knowing that the maximum lifespan at the time was 40. Like, they could have done something like that. I don't know if they did, but they probably did, because let's be honest, America runs on unpaid labor. We need it to survive economically, I mean, probably not really, but right now we think we do. And we know the thinking back then is pretty similar to the thinking now because we use the thinking back then to make all of our decisions now. And then 1808, external trade was banned. Once again, South Carolina was said, no, you can't do this to us, because that's a big issue. It's a big issue. I might make another video on this later. Is that our country is weird, because if a law is to be passed in Spain, it's going to be passed everywhere indefinitely. But if you're going to pass a law in America, you can either pass it statewide as a state-by-state basis, or you can pass it federally, and no one really knows which is better. But this is a big issue with, once again, slavery and women's rights and LGBT rights, is that it can be passed in individual states, and individual states can allow for, black people to have rights. Individual states can ban slavery. Individual states can allow for LGBT humans to get married. But then federally, it could still be illegal. And that's a big issue. That was one of Thomas Jefferson's issues with banning the slave trade, is that he said federally you're not going to partake in the Atlantic slave trade anymore. But he didn't know if he legally had the power to do that, because the Constitution says that whatever isn't specifically outlined in the Constitution to be a government right is now decided by the states. It doesn't really outline what exactly can be decided between a state basis and a federal basis, which is why, like, the South can ban abortion and birth control and whatever, and criminalize miscarriages on a state basis, but federally it hasn't passed yet, which is a really big issue, which is why it's so hard to get any kind of progress made in America. Because one state can decide it's a good idea, but then other states can decide it's not a good idea, and therefore doesn't get passed federally. Another big issue that made the 1808 external trade banning thing bad was that people in the North had been wanting the slave trade to be banned by America for a long time. And they brought this up in, once again, the Cabinet Battle number 3 for Hamilton, that Benjamin Franklin and a bunch of Quakers in Pennsylvania had said that we need to ban the slave trade and ban slavery in all its forms. And then, of course, they were like, oh, but we kind of all benefit from it, so it's going to be a no. And then James Madison said, well, what if we pass this agreement saying that we can't talk about it until 1808? And that's what they did. They made it virtually, illegal to talk about slavery or discuss fixing slavery in the White House until 1808, which only led it to get worse because now the slave population was higher. We depended more upon slavery. And so while we did ban the external trade in 1808, the internal trade did not stop. And that's how we got to the Underground Railroad, all that jazz, and then the Civil War. We'll get to that. And even though, the northern states are declared free states, even though they still have, indentured servants, racial segregation begins in the North because people are still racist. And Canada banned slavery way before they officially banned slavery. Canada is still, at this point, a British territory. And England banned slavery in Canada in 1833. But Canada itself kind of just unanimously decided that slavery was bad, way in the beginning of the 1800s, which is why the Underground Railroad, even though it went to the north, it could also go up to Canada, because Canada did allow for bigger freedoms of black people and former slaves than in the north, because once again, you could still have indentured servants, and it was a lot of segregation in the north. And also at this time, there was a lot of fugitive slave acts, basically deciding, oh, well, there's this Underground Railroad and the north is free, but if slaves escape from the south and head up to the north, do the owners have the right to follow them? And if they do catch them, are they allowed to take them back? If you see the slaves in the north, are they really free just because they're in the north, or do you have to give them back, and all that jazz? A bunch of different fugitive slave acts were passed, kind of just figuring out what to do in this general area. And of course, the Underground Railroad became prominent, trying to free slaves from the south to get up to the north. And then came the question of new territories, because America is an ever-expanding country. Not all legally, but me there. And now infighting begins in Kansas, trying to figure out if it is going to be a slave state or a free state. And James Buchanan, his gay ass, was just like, we'll let the people decide, which led to a lot of infighting because he was big pro-slavery presence and a big anti-slavery presence, and eventually all we got from it was a modern political system between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats believing that we should have slavery and Republicans believing that we should not have slavery. And now you're going to be like, well, aren't the Republicans the racist ones now? The Democrat ones are the bit more liberal ones, even though both of them are kind of just the same and no one gives a shit anymore. I'm going to say yes, and that is once again a story for another day. And then, of course, the Civil War happened. And we all know what that happened for. That got us the Emancipation Proclamation saying slavery is illegal, but it can still be a legal form of punishment. And that led to a bunch of laws being passed during Reconstruction to arrest black people so we could use them for slave labor. And those laws are, a lot of those laws are still in place, but a lot of them have been, like a lot of the pettier ones have been, abolished, but we still arrest a high amount of black people and other minorities to do our dirty work. And it sucks. So that is the history of slavery in the United States. And that is how it has formed the systems that we have now. Because even though we're out here and we have gotten a lot better, there's still a lot of systems in place that spur from this racial inequality and this feeling of white superiority. I'm not saying everyone, but, and it's not that laws specifically anymore are racist, because back then they were specifically, and they were really, open about being like, yeah, we have literacy laws because black people shouldn't vote because they aren't smart. We're going to make it extremely hard for black people to be able to learn how to read so they can't vote. Like, it was very like, we're doing this specifically to silence white voters. And now it's like now it's just more general laws that we have, and the reason that they are systemically racist is because we never went back and gave reparations and fixed the inequality that was caused through the laws in the beginning, Like, this has nothing to do with slavery. Well, I mean, the racism is still left over from slavery, but, redlining, where it's like we gave white people all this financial opportunity, but we didn't give any to black people. And even though redlining is illegal, that disparity is still there, so white people still have all these nice neighborhoods because they were able to grow financially and economically, whereas black people, once they live in these, like, really trashy neighborhoods, and we're like, oh, well, anybody could live in those neighborhoods, but it's like, no, these neighborhoods exist for a really racist reason, and we did nothing to try and fix that. So you can go and say the laws aren't racist now, but it's like they were racist, and even though we stopped them, we didn't go back and create that equality again, So I hope you learned something, and I really enjoy learning about this. This is not something that we talk about a lot in schools. Actually, this year we actively avoided talking about race at all, because we were like, oh, we're going to talk about the Revolution. We're just going to skip over the Civil War era because you should all know that already, right? But apparently not, because we still have people in the South thinking the Confederacy won, and that the Confederacy wasn't racist. Yeah. Anyway, I hope you have a great day. I love you all. So long and thanks for all the fish. Be excellent to each other, and party on, dudes.